I'm Bridget and Delicato from Mindful Gardening and the Innisfil Seed Library, and welcome to our live Q&A. This session is part of the series Get Out and Grow, which has happened throughout the season, and it's in partnership with the Rizzardo Health Wellness Centre. You'll find registration info on my website, mindfulgardening.ca, or on the Rizzardo Health and Wellness Program on their website. The goal tonight is to answer your vegetable gardening questions, and I'll share some considerations this time of year, including harvesting and seed saving, which is always lots of fun and really an important thing to do, and to also offer some information and resources to help you succeed throughout the season, right to the end, right up until frost. We'll be recording tonight's session, so you can keep your cameras off if you prefer. When I do open up the floor for questions, you can feel free to turn on your mic and speak, or type your questions in at any time, and I'll be sure to take those up. So let's get started. So these are some common things to consider this time of year. So extend the harvest, let it seed, and feed the soil. So some of our favorite things in terms of extending the harvest are tomatoes and basil. So for tomatoes, it always happens as the season goes, they take a long time to mature, and October comes and you still have green tomatoes on your plant, but the temperatures are starting to drop and they're calling for a light frost. You can cover your tomato plants with a bed sheet or row cover overnight when we have those conditions in the forecast, and just be sure to remove them when the sun hits them in the morning so that they don't scorch. But that can give you that little extra time to have those ripen. But inevitably, you'll probably still have green tomatoes at the end of the season, and you can ripen those indoors. So just remove all the green tomatoes you have, put them in a cardboard box in a single layer, and a piece of newspaper, and just put it somewhere dark in your house, so not in a cold spot, just room temperature, and they'll ripen in that paper breathable packaging, and you'll have some tasty tomatoes hopefully ripening. Or you can use green tomatoes. I made a really delicious green tomato salsa last year, added my homegrown garlic to that as well, so you can do that. Or of course there's fried green tomatoes, so you can really extend that harvest. You don't have to pull the whole plant out and think that you've lost all of that produce. You can ripen them or use them when they're green. Another favorite that goes with tomatoes, of course, is basil. Now, basil does not like frost, so you'll find even with a light frost or as the temperatures dip, they'll start to turn brown. But one way through the season, and even right now, we still have really nice hot weather, is to take those flower stalks that start to emerge. So if you're starting to see flowers emerging on your basil, of course you can leave some, because I'll talk about that a little later in terms of seed saving and pollinators. But if you want more of those leaves, just snip off that top stalk of flowers, and the energy will go from seed production into those leaves again, and you'll have lots to harvest. And of course, again, with the looming cold temperatures coming, you don't want to waste that beautiful plant, when it turns brown. So snip the whole plant down. You can make pesto, you can freeze it, you can can it, or take the whole plant, hang it upside down and dry it. And then you've got, wonderful dried basil, which is delicious in cooking, and you can add that to your spice rack. So that's a couple of sort of popular things and ways to extend that harvest. And of course, as we're moving into the cooler season, there are a lot of plants that do really well. For example, spinach. You might have planted that in the spring, and now you can plant them again for fall harvest. And not only can you plant a lot of things in the fall, but you can extend the season with some tricks to protect them. So, for example, you can grow spinach, mustard greens, baby kale, lettuce, cilantro. To extend that season even more, you might want to think about building a cold frame. So if you have an old window and you can build a box, there's so many resources online to see how to make your own. You can be eating salad in December with snow, brush the snow off the top of the top of your cold frame, and have, lots of those cool loving things that would die otherwise if they weren't protected somewhat. You can also think of hoop tunnels, which is usually a little earlier in the season, because once you start getting, snow and and really cold temperatures, you're better off with a cold frame. It's a little sturdier, but you can get away with your hoop tunnel at the end of the fall. And also mulch around your plants. So that's always a good thing. Just generally, even in the summer, it keeps that soil sort of a moderate temperature. So by doing that later in the season, you're also protecting the root system from those cold temperatures. So you'll just, again, extend that harvest. And of course, let it seed, our next little category here. Really important and dear to my heart as I run the Innisfil Seed Library. It's really a wonderful skill to have to save your own seeds. And, you know, if you have your old favorites, you'll never be out of those seeds if you learn how to save them. So talking about, again, tomatoes and squash, I always recommend the fermentation process. You can find a video on the Mindful Gardening YouTube channel, which you can access through the website on how to do that step by step. It basically gives you the healthiest seed. It gets rid of all that pulp that's around, you know, pulpy seeds like your tomatoes and your squashes, your cucumbers. So it gets rid of that. It gets rid of any pathogens that might be hanging around in that gel, and it just gives you a clean, good seed. So I always recommend that. And I'll be going into detail about how to do the fermentation process at our upcoming final webinar, Harvesting and Seed Saving, which is happening September 22nd. So I'll be showing you step by step how to do that. It is a bit of a process, but it's really at the end of the day pretty easy. And I always have, honestly, 100% viability when I test those seeds. They just do really well. It's a sort of a surefire way to save seeds. Lettuce seeds are actually quite easy to save. Essentially, leave the plant alone. So right now I have lots of lettuce bolting. Bolting is when the center of the lettuce plant sort of reaches for the sky, the leaves become very bitter, and then the end of that spike are little buds, which will become flowers and seeds. The pollinators love them. They produce just tons of little flowers, usually little yellow flowers. And then when you just leave that, again, on the living plant, you don't want to snip the plant when those seeds are producing. You want the most mature, dry seed on that living plant, which in the end will be the most viable seed for you. So again, just leave the lettuce, let it be, and you'll have hundreds of lettuce seeds. Right now I have sort of mixed leaf lettuce, so I'm going to just sort of have a mixed variety that I can grow next year. And the nice thing too is inevitably some will fall and those will self-seed. So you'll find lettuce popping up in your yard, which is kind of nice when you have those volunteers. Legumes are another easy one. Again, you just leave it on the plant until the pods dry and brown, and you can actually hear the peas or beans rattling inside. That's when, you know, those dry beans, you can actually eat those dry beans if you like to make soups and such. You know, leaving those to dry on there will give you the most mature, most viable seeds to grow next year. Just looking over, I've got a question about lettuce seeds. How do I know when it's dry enough? So what you'll see is after it flowers, again, like I said, it's usually a little yellow flower, then it'll get these little tufts. So you'll see these little white tufts, which is actually what carries those seeds. Once those tufts appear, you're pretty sure that those seeds are ready. So if you just simply squeeze one of those little tuft flower heads, you'll see tiny little lettuce seeds. They can be black, brown, white. So it's a pretty sure telltale sign once those little fluffs appear. And again, like just test it and see. Sometimes they'll do it sort of in stages. You'll have a few with tufts, a few still flowering. You can wait till the whole plant has done its thing, or if you're like me and a little obsessed with it, you can go around and snip those little dried tufts and just keep collecting them. And I do have a video as well on how to clean those easily, because you've got the tuft and the chaff and all that extra stuff with your lettuce. So you can find a video on lettuce seed saving on the Mindful Gardening YouTube as well. So herbs, again, another easy plant to seed save. And again, when you let those flower, so again, if you want to have those basil leaves, but leave a few basil to flower. Pollinators love herb flowers. So you've got cilantro, dill, basil. All those beautiful little flowers will bring all those tiny little pollinators to your yard, which will, in the end, also pollinate your other veggies and such, just increasing your harvest. So if you let those, again, dry on the plant, dill, you'll see they'll have sort of a pulpy little seed on them, which is a good stage if you're making pickles, when they're kind of still soft and succulent. But once they dry and they start to darken, that's when you're ready to snip. So wait till that happens on the plant. I find with cilantro, right now I have cilantro that's gone to seed. They're very potent when they're fresh. So you've got the little green seeds on the end. They can take a really long time to dry. I have found success just pulling the whole plant out of the ground and hanging it upside down, and the seeds will dry then. They become sort of papery light and brown seeds. So that's one way you could do that. Basil, you'll know, is ready after it flowers. The little pods along the sort of stalk will start to sort of have a little more definition, no more flowers. And again, similar to the lettuce, give one of those little pods just a little squeeze, and they have tiny little black seeds. So if they're tiny and shiny, black seeds, they're ready. If they're still green, they're not quite mature yet. So again, basil, you want to keep that living plant going until those seeds develop and dry on that plant. And it can take a while. Also consider biennial seeds, meaning you grow the plant this year and next year it produces its seeds. So you're leaving that plant in the ground over winter. And there's lots of plants that you can do that with. Parsley, for example. So I have sort of each season I have both happening. I have the seeding parsley and the parsley that I grow this year to eat. So next year that parsley will come up. It'll kind of look like, your typical parsley little bush, but then again, a big stalk will come up, and it's the same family as dill, the sort of umbel family. So you'll get that same sort of little umbrella, upside down umbrella that pops up at the top. And similar to the dill seed, you'll let that next year flower and seed. So my parsley from last year is currently at that stage. So it kind of looks like dill. They're still quite green, and I'm just waiting for those little seeds to dry on the ends before I harvest them, because then I'll know they're the most mature and the most viable. So a comment here is that your parsley dies each fall. Sometimes it doesn't make it. I do find if it's in a sheltered area and if you mulch the heck out of it, so put a lot of preferably shredded fall leaves on top, it'll protect that root system, because that's what's dying is the roots. If you can insulate it a little bit, or if you've seen my other webinars, you'll know I like to interplant. So I have, my parsley growing next to coneflowers, and it's in my veggie garden. So they're kind of beside other plants, and they have that sort of added protection. So I'd say about 90% that survive by doing that. So I'm putting a nice thick layer of some sort of mulch on top and some sort of way to protect it. Yeah, give it a try, because it does have a nice deep root system, like a carrot almost. So if you can protect that, it's a pretty sturdy plant that can come up. And just remember where you left it. That's the trick with biennial seeds that you've left, is knowing that they're there. So when you're doing your spring cleanup, you don't accidentally damage it, because that has happened too, where I've had the rake out and I'm like, oops, I've just popped out a parsley there. But if it's already starting to grow and you're seeing some green, you can even transplant it somewhere else in your garden and it'll do just fine. I moved some into pots actually because I wanted more garden bed space, so you can do that. Other biennials are carrot. So carrot, if you leave some carrots in the ground, again, umbel family, they'll have that stalk come up, that little upside down umbrella with lots of seeds, carrot seeds for you next year. So that's a fun one. Now the trick with those is they are the same family as Queen Anne's lace, which you've probably seen growing wild in ditches. And if you're like me, it's in my backyard and sort of the wild part. It can cross with the carrot, not to make it inedible, but you might get some sort of interesting variety of carrot if you do that. Swiss chard, kale, beets, all will seed for you next year. So if you do have the space and you want to give it a shot, leave some of those in the ground and see what you get. It's kind of neat. And then you'll get those flowers again for pollinators the next year. And they're kind of an interesting addition to your vegetable garden if you sort of give them that space. So Another thing to consider, of course, is to feed your soil. So you have been growing things all season long. You've been stripping that soil of nutrients. In some cases, some plants do give nutrients back. For example, legume roots will actually give nitrogen back to that soil. So that's always a good tip, is actually leave the roots of any of your beans or peas in the ground, and they'll rot over winter and provide nitrogen to your soil. But generally, you want to give the soil a good boost. And late fall is a great time to do that, because you can do it in the spring as well. But I find when I add it in the fall, it has that really long period for that magic to happen underground. So you've got, your winter thaw and all that moisture in the spring that's taking all of those nutrients, all of those microbes, which is also happening in the fall when you've applied it. So you've got the worms doing their thing, you've got the, microbes doing their thing. So by the time spring rolls around and you plunk those seeds in, you've got some incredible soil. So sort of the top 3 things that I like to add are manure, plant or sea compost. Sea compost is neat. It actually has crushed shrimp shells, so you get a lot of calcium too in your compost. I tried that one year and it was actually quite good. But of course, if you do your own compost, add that. It's always a wonderful thing to have. Or if you have worm castings, if you do vermicomposting, add some of that. And again, mulch leaves. I never waste my leaves. You'll never see a bag of leaves on my curb. I just love to mulch it up, like shred it if you have a shredder, and mix it into the soil. So you've got those 3 components and that. And then I also add a layer on top, and I put it everywhere, every garden. My perennial gardens, again, you're protecting the root systems, you're insulating. And then next year, again, when all those microbes and worms wake up, they will eat those leaves and again provide all that, as they call it, black gold castings into your soil. So it'll sort of disappear, usually about maybe 3 inches throughout your gardens. You'll be amazed at how wonderful your gardens will look. It also will suppress weeds, which is another great thing. Seeing a question here. Oh, beets and carrots. Raised beds should be fine. I mean, you are, a little above that soil line, but at the same time, you're warming up sooner in the spring because you are a bit above ground. Again, if you mulch with leaves or any sort of straw, it should be fine and insulated. I once had a question about growing garlic in a raised bed, and we did an experiment, and it was just fine. We did mulch it with straw, and that protected it just enough. So yeah, if you have a raised bed and you want to overwinter your beets and carrots, that should be just fine. This is really the time to think about planting garlic. It's a wonderful thing to do, to have your own homegrown garlic. It's something you'll typically do between October 1st and on November 15th. It's usually an activity I do Thanksgiving weekend. And what that happens is when you plant it at that time, and it gives the roots a chance to establish before the ground freezes. So by next year, the little sprouts will come up and you'll have wonderful garlic. And really the key to growing your garlic is to find a sunny location, amend your soil again, if you're doing that anyway right now. So you've pulled out some plants. For example, I'll be planting my garlic where my tomatoes were. So once my tomatoes come out, which, typically around that Thanksgiving mark, they'll probably be, pretty much done. If I'm tired of covering them and I'm just harvesting those green tomatoes to ripen indoors, now I've got a nice blank slate to grow my garlic. So I'll be amending that soil and adding the garlic to that nice, rich soil. Again, manure, compost, wonderful things for your garlic. And of course, if you can find local garlic, it's a great thing. So you can check out your farmers markets, a lot of local farms. If you drive by, you'll sometimes see signs on country roads that say garlic. Now is the time to get it. Garlic is now dried, and most farms will have separated what they call seed garlic. So they're biggest bulbs that are good for growing and eating, of course. So keep your eye out. This is the time to think about it so that you're not left in a lurch by the time October rolls around, which it is coming, even though we're still in the beautiful days of August. So again, how do you plant it? If you don't have your own garlic, so I'll have some of my own. I'll be buying some more as well. With the pandemic, I didn't grow as much as I usually do. So I will be supplementing with some local garlic. And yeah, so you've got your locally grown garlic, hopefully. You want to separate those cloves, leaving those papery coverings on each one. You don't want to completely peel the garlic or it will just rot underground. So keeping that intact. If you accidentally expose some of the flesh, eat that for dinner that night and use the others that are nicely covered. And then when you're planting it, similar to other bulbs, you're planting the tip up so that one clove with its tip up will produce a bulb. So that goes in typically 4 inches deep and 6 inches apart is a good sort of measurement. It gives them lots of room to grow and lots of room for you not to accidentally stab it when you're harvesting next year. And again, covering it and insulating it. You could use leaves, but again, leaves will break down next year when the worms do their thing. So it's not something that will necessarily be on your garlic bed all season. So I find straw is the best application. Usually a good 6 inches. You get the water to come through. It protects it. It keeps the soil at a consistent temperature. I never have to water my garlic. I just, let nature do its thing, and I always have a lot of success. If you want to learn more about how to grow garlic, again, I do have a video series actually that goes from planting to harvesting and to drying and curing, which is really important because if you want to have them, into the winter, usually about 8 months worth of time with that garlic, then you'll want to properly dry and cure it before you cut it and store it. So now I'll just open up the floor. I know we took up some questions, but if you have any questions as we're moving into fall or any issues you've come across with your veggies, I'd be happy to answer them. My heirloom tomatoes are 6 feet tall with greens, very few flowers or tomatoes. Any suggestions? So you have the same issue last year. So tomatoes are pretty heavy feeders. So they like really nutrient-rich soil. So if they're just simply not producing flowers, it could be that there was some deficiency in the soil. So again, if you get, that manure, that compost in this year, try not to plant your tomatoes in the same spot every year. You want to rotate your crops because if there were any issues, and tomatoes are kind of delicate. They do have issues like I just mentioned, the blight, for example, the yellowing of leaves and such. You could be transferring some of those problems. So you've added peat moss and sea compost. Okay. I would try to add manure this year, I would suggest. Because it's kind of tricky because if they're not producing flowers, sometimes you'll have flowers drop. Even with your peppers. And that's typically a sign of sort of fluctuating temperatures. So you've got extreme heat or cool nights and those flowers just can't handle that. And you've had some drops. I had that happen with pepper plant. It's finally kind of taken off again now that the weather's a little more consistent and hot, but I was having a lot of flower drop. So I would do manure as soon as that where you're planning to plant your tomatoes. Typically, it's sort of a fall project. So if you think of September as a time to amend the soil, you can do it in the spring as well if you don't have the time. But I just find having that extended period to let those different nutrients mix in with your soil and have nature kind of take its course. That's what I would suggest is that you do that. And also think about feeding your tomato plants through the season as well, because it's possible if you're getting lots of green that you're very high in nitrogen, but you're maybe lacking in other nutrients that they could have to produce that fruit. So you could commercially buy, preferably organic components to give the potassium and the phosphorus, which are the other couple of good amendments to add to your soil to produce fruit. So that's probably what's happened is they're lacking the nutrient required for fruit production. I'd mentioned comfrey tea before. That has everything. It's got all three, the nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. So if you can, through the season, give them a drink of that. It's a plant you can grow in your yard and make a tea out of it. And it's kind of magic. It did wonders for eggplant for me. I've never really had success with eggplant, and I've been feeding it the comfrey tea, and I've had a lot of results this year, which is pretty exciting. When you are in a garden center, you can actually see fertilizers that are made for tomatoes or fruiting plants. So look for ones that aren't high in the nitrogen, but high in the other two, the potassium and the phosphorus, because those two will build cells too in the plant, but also that fruit production, flower production. But again, if you have really healthy, well-balanced soil, you should get pretty good results. And again, with the flowers that are already existing on your plant, you can sort of trick it in terms of pollinating. If you're not having the insects around, just give the plant a little shake, because each flower contains both male and female parts, so you'll get more fruit that way. So with your existing flowers, I'd recommend you do that with your existing ones. You might still be able to give it a boost. I mean, we're sort of end of summer, but you might, if you do amend it with some natural fertilizer, you should be able to get some more flowers. And asking about how to make the comfrey tea again. So again, comfrey is a very leafy plant that's quite generous, grows quite abundantly. It also flowers, and bumblebees love the purple sort of bell-shaped flower, that stalk that comes up. But you can snip the leaves throughout the season, and they're quite broad. They're sort of a nice, large, almost elephant ear size, tropical plant size leaves. You chop that up, put it in a 5-gallon bucket of water, and you just stir it, put a lid on it, and just let it decompose. And it becomes a sort of brown slurry. What I even did this year was I collected all of it in the fall, and I overwintered it indoors. So I had a bucket of comfrey tea. And in terms of how much leaf you have, the more the better. It's very concentrated. So when you're actually using the comfrey tea, you're using it 3 to 1. So one, typically I'll have like a nice 4-cup measuring cup of the comfrey tea, and then I'll do another 3 of those, so is that 12 cups of water to that, or else you'll burn the plant, because it is just so concentrated. So you put that in a watering can, and you kind of got your magic. So I'll be collecting all my comfrey leaves at the end of the season, and I just keep adding to it. So it's a pail of sort of this brown, very stinky slurry of really high nutrients, because it's got trace minerals as well. The comfrey plant has a really deep root, which just pulls up all the good stuff from the earth. So it's kind of a magic plant that I recently discovered in recent years, and it's really done wonders, especially for fruiting plants, I find. Tomatoes. So anything that fruits, I put it on my tomatoes. Like I said, my eggplant, my cucumbers, even leafy things. Like I find leafy things don't need as much help. I find, you want more fruit on a lot of those plants, your peppers as well. Anything that fruits really benefits from the comfrey tea. Some problems you might be seeing now, sometimes, especially with powdery mildew, it may be too far gone. So your cucumber plants have, their leaves have been affected. So something you could think about is learning for next year. Typically, those problems can happen when there's overcrowding, because when there's overcrowding and there's moisture can lead to a lot of diseases. So think about creating more space for things like that, so that the leaves aren't, overlapping and touching, and they're crowded with other plants. Try to use some of those challenges we found this year to help next year. I also talked about covering your young plants with row cover, your squash or your cucumber plants, to avoid some of those cucumber beetles and some of those pests, so that you can have a strong seedling established before they kind of come to the scene. Knock on wood, I actually didn't see any cucumber beetles this year. I'm not really sure how that happened, but didn't have a problem. But I know some people do, and it can devastate your crop. But if you have a healthy plant, again, healthy soil, healthy plant, you might have a better chance of getting ahead of it if the problem does arise. And as I mentioned with tomatoes, not planting them in the same spot. If you do have blight, which you may see wilting yellow leaves, dark spots, I have seen some folks that will, they grow their tomatoes in a certain spot every year, and every year they get blight and they wonder why. Well, those diseases will stay in the soil and transfer again and again. So that's why crop rotation is really important. Grow something else. So next year, like I said, I'm growing my garlic where my tomatoes were. My tomatoes will be somewhere else. Just to rotate those crops and not have those diseases keep carrying on. If you do have blight, but you have some fruit on that plant, again, you can try harvesting them and, the natural way, if you may still get ripened fruit. If not, if the plant is really far gone and you're afraid that you'll lose those tomatoes, you can try that trick of bringing them indoors and letting them ripen indoors. I'm just going to kind of go over some tips. Again, plan ahead. So are you going to plant this fall? Are you going to plant spinach, for example? Do you have your seeds? Garden centers and even grocery stores are still have their seeds available. So get your hands on some of those fall plantings if you're interested. And which plants will you leave to collect seeds, possibly? Will you leave some carrots, some beets? Give that a try, see what happens. I always recommend parsley. If it does survive the winter, it's just a great thing to have. It's one of my favorite herbs. Do you have your seed garlic? Do you have a supplier that you get from every year? Do you have your own garlic that you've grown that you're ready to grow? And visit your local garden centers. Some of them will close down for the winter. Then you have to wait till spring, till they open the doors, typically in March, to get your amendments. So if you can do that now, whether you apply them in the fall or the spring, it's always a good idea to get your hands on all that stuff. Especially with the pandemic, you may have noticed manure. I always would say manure was the new flour, when you couldn't find flour anywhere. I couldn't find manure last year. It was really tricky. This year, it was kind of borderline. I did find some, but it's kind of flies off the shelves because a lot of people are gardening, which is great, but it's also challenging sometimes to get those amendments. So typically, even though I know it's a great idea to do this in the fall, people think about gardening in the spring and through the summer. So you probably have a better chance of finding those amendments now if you start looking for your soil prep. And did you grow something that you loved this season? Save their seeds. If you grew this beautiful heirloom tomato, you may not find those seeds again. And really, it's so important to save seeds because we keep those varieties alive. So if you grew something that you love, save those seeds. And of course, don't forget the pollinators. So if you do allow your herbs to flower, you'll get seeds in the end as well. But bees and all sorts of tiny little guys, they just love those delicate flowers that are produced on herbs. And also if you plant perennials, so you've got your veggie garden, but if you can plant perennials nearby, especially native perennials, so if you've got coneflower or black-eyed Susan, one of my favorites is Joe Pye weed. The monarchs are just all over those. You'll bring those pollinators, and in the end, those pollinators will increase your harvest because they'll pollinate your veggies. And try to find perennials that bloom all seasons. So you've got your spring bloomers, your midsummer, and your fall. They'll just keep on your property all through that time. And especially if you're growing fruit or vegetables right through to the end of the season, you'll have those pollinators still visiting because they have other flowers to visit. I have a question here. I snipped off lettuce seeds and kale seeds and have them drying in a mesh hanging tray. Did I snip them too soon? I didn't think to leave them on the plant to dry. Well, if you give it a look, I know for me, my lettuce is just starting to bolt or flower, I should say. It hasn't even quite flowered yet. It also depends on when you grew it. If this was your really early spring lettuce, because it does take a while from bolting to seed production. But you'll know, as I mentioned, the question, how do you know when lettuce seeds are ready? If they have that little tuft, they kind of have to have that little tuft because that little dry white tuft at the end, they carry the seeds. So if you just take one of the little buds and sort of rub it, they should be dry lettuce seeds inside. If they're still green, they probably won't be viable for you. Your kale, so you said that kale seeds, so you would have overwintered that kale from last year, if that's correct. Those as well could be possibly be ready, but again, you'd have to think about what a neat thing to do too is if you don't know what the seed looks like, if you don't recall or you're just not sure, Google it and see if it looks like that. Your kale seed should be little balls, sort of dark brown to black. And if they look like that, then they are dry. But typically you'll want that living plant to flower and go to seed and then dry a bit. So it kind of looks pretty straggly by the time you're harvesting it. Even the lettuce will kind of go brown, the whole plant. Right now, my lettuce plants are very green with those buds starting. But yeah, if you give that a try, give a little test, especially with those two plants, there's lots to test. Again, if you did pull it too early, you learned something. Yeah, my biggest tip with seed saving really is have it on depending on what it is, of course. Your tomatoes, your squash, those are seeds that are contained within a fruit. So it's a different seed saving process. But when there's seeds that dry on the plant, like beans and lettuce, those kinds of things, and even all the herbs that I mentioned, the longer you leave that on the plant alive, the better you'll get. It's actually better to be sort of even more conservative and longer. So really, you can even be collecting those seeds, just as you're doing your fall cleanup. Like my parsley and my dill are not nearly ready yet. I'll wait until they've sort of browned. And again, I'll do a little test, see if it looks like what I know those seeds to look like when they're dry or when you buy them commercially. That's always a good trick. But typically, if something's very green, very immature, it probably won't grow for you. If you're unsure, you can try viability testing, which is super simple. You basically are testing your seeds to see if they're viable, whether you're not sure if they're mature enough or you have old seeds or someone gave you seeds, have no idea where they came from or how old they are. You take a wet paper towel, put, just for percentage sake, 10 of those seeds down. You fold it over, put it in a plastic baggie, seal it. Doesn't have to be anywhere particularly warm. You can just put it in a drawer. To speed it up, I do this near my fireplace in the winter because it does speed up the germination. But typically within a week, if you open up that napkin and, at least 50% of them have sprouted for you, or better yet, 100%, you'll know that you have a fairly viable seed. So that's one way to test it if you're not sure. Ooh, celery. That is a really interesting question. I've actually never saved celery seeds. I'm trying to think if it's like if it will seed this year or next year. That's a really good question. That's something I can look into and let you know. I'll post it to Facebook. If you follow Innisfil Seed Library on Facebook, I can dig into that and see. But that's a really great question. Pink celery, that sounds beautiful. But yeah, I've honestly never grown it, so I'm not sure how those seed. Oh, you did viability taste and it gave you a lot of grief. So you tested seeds and is it that they weren't viable or just a lot of work? I mean, honestly, if you do the viability testing, I think it saves you grief later because there's nothing worse than putting things in the ground and they just don't come up. Or, if you're an indoor seed starter under grow lights and you're waiting and they just don't grow for you, it can be even more heartbreaking. I always find it's better to know way ahead of time. So it's typically something I do in January and February. I'm also doing a lot of that in preparation for the Innisfil Seed Library, which is folks borrow seeds to grow at home. So all of these donations come in. And again, I didn't save the seeds. And even if I did, I still test them. But I do test about 90% of the seeds to make sure that they're viable, at least 70 to 90% viability, because there's nothing more disappointing than trying to grow your tomato seeds and they don't come up. So I think it's well worth the time if you have it. Yeah, seeds don't last forever, unfortunately. I kind of have this number in my head, 3 years, but it really depends. I know some people that have really saved bean seeds or even tomato seeds for 10 years and were able to grow them. They were just, I guess, in optimal storage conditions. So the way you store your seeds is really important. Again, I'll be talking about this more at my upcoming webinar on September 22nd. So harvesting and seed saving. Storage is so key because it will extend the life of those seeds. Because you imagine all that energy in those little dormant seeds just don't last forever. But if you store them properly, you can give them just that extra life force that they need to germinate and grow for you. So storage is really important. Oh, so you did have some that were viable, all heirloom tomatoes. Well, that goes to show you those heirlooms, they've heirloom meaning they've got a history. So they've been growing for years. They're usually a hardy variety, and it's so important to keep those alive. So you will find sometimes those will do better for you than maybe a hybrid or something that's not necessarily heirloom. So that's interesting. But yeah, if you have seeds that are dating back, that even more reason to check for viability. But know that they may not last for you, which is why it's so important to keep growing them every year and saving them every year. So you always have your own little seed bank, so to speak. And with the seed library, we do ask for seeds that are either from the current season that you've harvested them or fairly new. And if it's kind of borderline, even more so important to check their viability with that test. I'm going to mention some go-to resources, and again, more questions, please ask. If you are interested in putting on your winter boots and gardening, some people do it. The Year-Round Vegetable Gardener by Nikki Jabor. You may know Nikki. She has a website and very active on Instagram collectively with other gardeners called Savvy Gardening. So she's a pretty awesome author and gardener. So if you're interested in learning more about cold frames, for example, years ago I did try that and it worked. And I bought her book. And it was really helpful in giving you step-by-step DIY, and the resources on Savvy Gardening. Again, if you can find them on Facebook or look at their website, lots of tips that are really relevant. She's from out east, but a lot of the tips can be translated pretty well to Innisfil. So lots of really good tips and a lot of DIY, what you already have at home. Like I really like that kind of thing where you're not having to go to Home Hardware and, get everything from scratch. It's how can you build trellises and all sorts of things from things you might already have at home. Oh, I'm just seeing that you've donated heirloom seeds so others can enjoy it. Exactly. Yeah. If you can share your seeds, whether it's through the seed library, because then, you've got your community, your local Innisfilians growing your heirloom tomatoes, and it just keeps going from there. Share them with your neighbors, your friends. Seeds are a fun gift too if you tuck them in a card. I received seeds this year from a high school friend that I've reconnected with, and it was just such a lovely gesture. And I grew cucamelons for the first time this year from those seeds. I probably wouldn't have otherwise. So, and they're amazing. They're like these little mini watermelon looking cucumbers. So they're not a watermelon, but they're a cucumber with a sort of hint of lime and very prolific. So, again, it was gifted to me, and I'm going to try to save their seeds this year with the fermentation process. Okay, so your cucamelons are just starting to flower. Mine have been going for a few weeks now. We still got, a lot of season. They are pretty fast growers. It's a little tricky in terms of when they're ready to harvest. Again, it's kind of a taste test type thing, I kind of found. But if it's sort of the size of the tip of your finger, like from that first joint that seems to me to be sort of the right time to pick them. And they've got most of their green striping. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up, cucamelon. They're just these crazy little things. They're quite delicious. They originated from Mexico, so they do like hot temperatures. They were started by seed indoors. Took a while to get going, but now it's prolific and growing up a trellis. Also, it's your first year growing them as well. Yeah, and they've got just the cutest little yellow flower. I'm finding lots of pollinators. So again, if you get those pollinators, you'll get that fruit. So yeah, if you're just starting to flower now, hopefully you'll get some soon. And because they're so small, they grow pretty quickly and are pretty quick to harvest. And I'm trying to pickle them this year. So I found a recipe online with a little hint of sweetness to sort of counter that sourness. And I'm pretty excited to give that a try. I just did a sort of refrigerator pickle. So, you make a brine for it, and then it's something that lives in your fridge. So I have a few days before I can give it a taste test. And they're so pretty. Like, they're just the funniest looking things. Another really awesome resource is Fruition Seeds, really active on social media as well. They have a Instagram and Facebook and a website. Really wonderful farm in the States, but they do cover and give really great tips for zones 4 to 6. And we here in Innisfil are zone 5A. So we're kind of smack dab in the middle. So I take a lot of her advice on when to grow things, even tips of, when the goldenrod is blooming, this is what you do. So really good tips and lots of awesome information. And they sell seeds as well if you're interested in buying some really neat seeds. So yeah, I'd suggest checking them out. Lots of webinars that you can check out too. Really great resource. Of course, the Innisfil Seed Library, we have lots of resources on the website, both original content and lots of links to other resources that are just really worthwhile to share about seed saving, seed growing, and of course, seed advocacy. So all those groups that really push for seeds and keeping heirlooms alive and keeping farmers supported and that kind of thing. So lots of really good resources there. And of course, my Mindful Gardening website has all the links to videos. So a lot of how-to videos if you're interested in, like I said, the fermentation process for tomatoes, how to save lettuce seeds, how to grow garlic, all sorts of really good tips. It's me growing stuff at home. So hopefully it's applicable to all of you folks because we're all in the same community. Yeah, so those are sort of some really good go-to resources. Farmer's Almanac is a good one too. I like their approach too because it's organic approaches. It's, sort of the best for the environment, which is I'm always striving to do. The more you can do naturally without harming the environment, the better. So, really building your soil, having that healthy soil base, healthy plants, you've got your healthy seed. If everything that you're putting in your garden starts out healthy, so, if you have a weakling seedling that's just something about it, it's just not taking off, it's not doing well, the insects are attacking it, pull it out. Maybe it's not the best guy to have in there. Try to have your best put forward, which is the same with seed saving. Never save seeds from a diseased plant. So if you have blossom end rot on your tomato, which is when the bottom where the flower was rots, that's a sign of different things. It could be lack of water, too much water, lack of calcium. There are different strategies to try to combat that, but never save a seed from that plant because you're just carrying those diseases in that little seed. Never put a diseased plant in your compost. So if you had tomato blight or you had powdery mildew, put it in the garbage. Don't put it in your compost bin because you're just going to keep harboring all those illnesses and bringing it back to your base, your soil. Clean it up, rake up all those dead leaves. Don't mix it into your soil. Try to get that all out. So if every component from seed, soil, plant is healthy, and you do your best to protect those plants from insects and critters and give it good airflow so that moisture isn't getting trapped and causing illnesses, you'll probably have a lot more success. And if you didn't have success, you'll probably learn from those mistakes, and next year know that you need more space for certain plants, or better nutrients because things aren't performing as well. So it's always evolving, always a learning experience. Thank you so much. You can email anytime with questions. And of course, this webinar or Q&A has been recorded, as the whole series has. So if you want to come back to it, you can on the Mindful Gardening YouTube channel. And please do register for the final webinar in the series, Get Out and Grow, Harvesting and Seed Saving, which is happening September 22nd. And you can find the registration link on the website or the Rizzardo Health and Wellness. And the Innisfil Seed Library will be accepting seed donations at the Innisfil Idea Lab and Library's Lakeshore and Cookstown branches from September 1st to October 31st. So if you want to find out how to submit those seeds, get some tips on good practices for getting healthy, viable seeds to us, visit innisfilseedlibrary.ca for details on how to do that. Well, thank you so much, and get growing and happy gardening.